Hey there, writer rebels. Today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite literary devices, and that is motif. Hello everyone, it's me, Scarlett Kol, young adult author, YouTuber, and storyteller, and I am back with my Back to School Author Academy today to talk about motif. This video is something I've been really looking forward to as I really love this literary device, and I think a lot of you out there will probably really like it too, as I also refer to it as how to Taylor Swift your novel. Taylor Swift uses motif very often, and I will be using some of her examples as well to explain what motif is, what motif isn't, and how to use it in your prose. But before we get to that, I did want to say thank you to everybody who keeps coming back to my channel. If you want to be a subscriber on my channel so you don't miss any of my content, make sure you're hitting that subscription bar and the notification bell below this video. While you're down there, hit that thumbs up to let YouTube know this is something worth watching, and don't forget to join me for the rest of my Author Academy videos. If you've missed any so far, I do have them in a playlist, so you can definitely check that out. If you are interested in some other topics about writing and publishing, you might want to take a look around, as I do have several videos covering various different topics about publishing, writing, and all the fun stuff in between. So what is motif? Motif is the repeated use of an image, symbol, phrase, word, plot structure, etc. of something to deepen the symbolic meaning of that particular work. This is something that we see very often, whether we realize what it is or not, in books, in movies, in music videos, and very often in television and movies. Filmmakers love to use motif within their works, and you will understand why once I get through all of these examples. As I mentioned at the beginning, Taylor Swift is an excellent example of motif, as she tends to use this every time she kind of goes through a transition of her career. One really, really memorable one was during the Reputation era. If you remember, at that point, she had snakes in all of her videos, in a lot of her social media. A lot of the things she did involved snakes or reference snakes within the lyrics, etc., etc., etc. The snakes obviously were symbolic of various different disses and how people perceived her as an artist within the world. But that snake imagery constantly showed up in her videos and her music and everything that she put out to the public. So this was a motif during the Reputation era for Taylor Swift. And if you are to go through her videos and everything over time, you will see that she uses motif quite a bit every time she kind of reincarnates as the next butterfly that she's going to be. I love this about her, and I love following up on all the little Easter eggs and trying to figure out the motifs in between her various different videos and works. I'm sure everybody else there enjoys that, so you can definitely use this when you're writing your novels or you're writing your poems or whatever to punch up your prose and make it that much more entertaining for your audience by having a motif that runs through your work. However, before we talk about some examples of when and when not to use motif, I did want to discuss what motif is not. So a lot of people get very, very confused between motif, symbolism, and theme. So the theme of your novel or your work is obviously just going to be not necessarily a tangible thing. It's going to be a concept, it's going to be a feel, etc., etc. Motif is going to be something that's a little bit more concrete. It may help to convey the theme to your reader, but it isn't necessarily the theme itself. So when you're thinking about it, a theme is a lot more conceptual, whereas a motif is more of a demonstrated view of that theme. The other one that really gets confused with motif a lot, especially since the words are very similar, is symbolism. So motif does, in a lot of cases, use symbolism as a way of getting that motif across. However, a symbol itself is just something that represents something else. For instance, you see this a lot in TV and films. Maybe the hero wears a specific color, and every time something good happens or a character is good versus bad, they might be wearing one color versus another color. This is where that color is symbolizing the concepts of good and evil. It's really easy for the audience to see what the filmmaker wants to portray as good versus what they want to portray as bad. So those colors specifically would be symbols for something else. The color green does not necessarily mean good, but in a particular movie or something like that, if they're using green every time the hero appears or anybody who's on the hero's side, then that green is representing goodness or heroic qualities. Whereas, let's say they're using the color red every time the villain or somebody evil were to come on screen, then that color red in itself is not evil, but it does represent evil in that particular work. The reason these really get confused is because a motif often uses symbols when it is trying to convey its theme throughout a work. So the example that I just used with the colors, for instance, if you are seeing that color green throughout the work, the color green is a motif within that. However, the green color itself is a symbol, and it is using that symbol repeatedly for a motif. So a symbol is just literally the one-off object or concept that is representing something else. The motif is the repeated pattern of using that symbol or something else. It doesn't necessarily have to be a symbol throughout the work. If we want to take this a step further, in another example, basically, let's say we have a story about hidden identities, and throughout the story we have a masquerade ball and a mask shop, and it's Halloween. So the mask itself might represent duality or the hidden identity or the masking of one's own real self, whereas the repeated use of the mask throughout the story is the motif. The mask is the symbol, and the use of the mask is the motif. So now that we know what motif is, what are some examples? I already referenced Taylor Swift and the snakes during the Reputation era. So for that entire body of work, snakes were a motif. They symbolized something very important to her and her career and how people viewed her through the album, through her videos, through her social media, everything like that. But we also see it in other places, such as in The Wizard of Oz. There is the line, "There is no place like home." This is a good example of where motif is not symbolism, in the sense that it's actually spoken words throughout that story, as opposed to an object or a concept that we are using to represent something else. "There's no place like home" is pretty blunt in terms of what it's trying to say, and it's repeatedly through that piece of work, because this is really the theme of the story. If you've never read The Wizard of Oz, I hate to spoil it, but it's about a girl named Dorothy who leaves home and then ends up spending the entire story trying to get back to Kansas, to those people that love her and the people that are important to her. So to her, there is no place like home. And that is kind of something that is repeated through the story to really set off that theme and the entire purpose of the story itself. So another example is actually in my own work. I wrote a book called Falling. Falling is a retelling of The Little Mermaid. However, I did venture from the source material a little bit, because this story is about a girl named Ariana, and she's an angel as opposed to a mermaid. Because I did want to tie it back to the original source material, I did have her reference a lot of things in terms of water or the ocean or the sea. So she does reference sirens. Sometimes she uses the words fathoms instead of other terms to describe things. And the main love interest, Griffin, which would be, I guess, my Prince Eric if you followed the Disney version of The Little Mermaid, he has very blue eyes, and she refers to them in terms of water, open expanses of water. And obviously, as his emotions and everything change throughout the story, she can describe it in different ways, as seeing an ocean or body of water that is, going through a storm or on a calm day, etc., etc., etc. I also do have some straight up references to water. They do go out by a lake, and we do have some descriptions of physical water itself. My whole point of that is to have the symbolic resonance of The Little Mermaid in a story that doesn't actually have mermaids in it, even though it has the same themes, a lot of the same plot points, and has the same kind of overall message at the end of the book. I really wanted to make sure that the audience was getting that touch point, even though they weren't getting the actual mermaid tale that they expected. Anyway, so when would you want to use motif? So those are some great examples, but how are you going to use it in your work to punch your work up? Well, one of the things that's kind of come up a few times is to convey theme. Obviously, if you have a theme in your book and you are repeating a symbol or set of words, etc., 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 throughout your work, then you are going to be using them to convey a theme. If your theme is love conquers all, you're probably going to have either phrasing or symbols or something like that that's going to keep pushing that idea to the reader throughout the book. Another thing that you can use that for is aesthetic or mood. So if you want to create a certain vibe within your story, you can definitely use motif to do that. For instance, if you're writing something with like a dark academia kind of feel, you might want to have some darker imagery that is repeated throughout the book. Maybe you have a thing for skeleton keys or old books or antique clocks, something like that. Maybe this is something that you can work in to have symbolism throughout your story to create that kind of vibe that your reader is going to get from your story. Another way to use motif is to show character traits. When I mentioned before in terms of filmmaking, if you have everybody who is a hero or considered good wearing green and everybody who is a villain or considered evil wearing red, every time a character were to walk on screen, you would immediately be able to figure out what side they're on based on what color they're wearing. So if a character were to walk on screen fully in red, then the watcher is going to know immediately that that character is evil. This is a very quick and easy way to demonstrate character without having to get into a lot of backstory. It also doesn't need to be that obvious. You could have something that the character maybe has a particular object that they carry with them that can have symbolic meaning. They might have a particular pet like Nagini with Voldemort in the Harry Potter series, whereas we go back kind of to that snake imagery again, where, you know, snakes kind of have that idea of not being able to be trusted, that they are a little bit slimy, slithery, that kind of thing. And obviously that's the kind of character we have with Voldemort. So it could also be on a positive angle as well. It doesn't necessarily have to mean something negative. It could be a positive symbol or imagery that we are repeating every time that character appears or we reference that character. So this is a really easy way to demonstrate character traits to the reader without having to hash it out over and over and over again. One of my absolute favorite ways to use motif is to use quotes or spoken word to show character growth. So let's say, for example, we have a young man and his grandfather has a particular phrase that he says a lot during the first portion of the book. The young man either disregards it or maybe doesn't even pay much attention to it during that point in the book. He goes off on his hero's journey and we get towards the climax of the book, and at that point, the young man repeats the line that his grandfather would have said to him, or thinks it in his head, or it comes up in some sort of way. I've also seen sometimes where it's echoed back to them by the villain or the antagonist back to the protagonist, and they finally click into, this is what this means, and this is going to be the missing piece for me to solve the problem or defeat the villain or whatever they happen to be working through in that particular story. That is one I absolutely love because it kind of has that nice echo effect to it, and I adore that. This is something you can also see very often in romances, where you will see one of the love interests will say something or have a catchphrase towards the beginning of the book that sometimes irritates the other love interest, or they just aren't paying attention to it. And then they get towards the end of the story and they get into a position where, yet again, they either hear it again or repeat it out themselves. Typically they'll repeat it themselves. And at that point, they will realize that they are meant for that other person and that they need to find them. You can also use that in a more symbolic way, in the sense that, let's say one love interest is a baseball player. So we are going through the story and there's constantly symbolism tying that person to baseball. When we get to the end of the story and we're at the dark night of the soul, the two lovers are separated for whatever reason, and the other love interest is now seeing baseball everywhere. They're passing a little league game. Somebody's fundraising for their baseball team. The person in front of them at the coffee shop is wearing a baseball hat of this person's favorite team or the team that they play on. And then this is going to be the moment where that person realizes that, wait, I'm in love with them. And then we're going to have that resolution as the two couples come together. Obviously, they've probably already been thinking about it. These are just little reminders that are peppered through the story to bring that to the forefront. This is a great use of motif, and I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorites that I see a lot. If you're using rom-com, obviously you can kind of go a little bit further with this and make it almost a little over the top so that people really get the point, or it can be very, very subtle and only those people that are paying really close attention to the prose are going to get it. It's a great way to use motif and to show that character growth and character arc. Super fun. Another way to use motif is to link things within your world. If you're writing a series, then you might have a specific symbol or phrase that comes up often throughout your various different books, and that way kind of ties everything together nicely for the reader. If they're only reading one particular series or one book, you probably won't catch it, but for those people who are big fans and have read everything within that world, it's really going to have that extra resonance and that extra meaning to them. So that could be a really cool thing that you can do for your audience, and it's also just kind of fun as an author to be able to do that. The other thing you can use motif for is foreshadowing, which can be done in a couple of different ways. Obviously, every time, let's say, a villain is to appear shortly before, we're going to see bees. So if you have bees showing up as a motif throughout your story, it's going to kind of show that something's coming, or maybe that things are escalating. They do use the spiders in Harry Potter. You see spiders a lot through, can't remember which book it is, but you see spiders a lot, and then all of a sudden you see all the spiders going out to the woods. And this is kind of showing the more spiders as the story goes on, that the danger is progressing and that it's getting progressively worse. So once we see a ton of spiders and it's really, really obvious where they're going, this is the point where we get to that point in the story that it makes a difference and it makes an impact. So we have this motif of spiders throughout that particular story. So it can definitely show that something is coming, something is growing, and you can use it in particular places every time you reference that character, that plot line, etc. You can also use this a lot in mysteries or thrillers, for example. So if you want to be really cheeky, maybe you can tell us who the killer is right from the beginning. So let's say, for instance, you're writing a thriller and the uncle is the murderer. If you have references to Hamlet, if anybody knows anything about Hamlet, it is the uncle that kills the king. So if you maybe have a copy of Hamlet sitting somewhere, or you have references of lines from that, or maybe a character is named that, and you just have these slight little peppered references through the book, you might know technically from page 2 that the uncle did it. This is a fun, cheeky sort of foreshadowing kind of way that you can put motif into your books, which is really, really fun. Plus, when the reader gets to that point in the story, it's going to be very obvious to them what happened. One of the things that a lot of readers dislike in mysteries or thrillers is that they get to the point of who the killer is or whatever, and it just doesn't make sense, or the signs weren't there. The more signs that you can kind of put in there that this is the way that it was supposed to be, the more satisfying the reader is going to feel when they get that resolution. These little things are not going to be super obvious to a lot of people, but if they go back after they find out who the killer is, it may make things a little more clear and be like, oh, that's why that was there. And a final reason that a lot of people like to use motif is to convey emotions. So obviously, if you are repeating something throughout a book, it can definitely tie to a person's mental state. And as we know as writers, one of the things you do want to try to avoid doing when you are talking about people's emotions is basically just, he was mad, she was sad. You want to show your audience how they are feeling without actually just telling them. It's that show versus tell thing. By using motif, this could be a really easy way for you to show how that person is feeling. I used this recently in a book I wrote called Sleepless. So in Sleepless, in our first scene, we have a character who is very stressed out. She can't sleep, and she refers to a yoga class, and she starts breathing, and it's audible. So inhale, exhale, and I actually use it as a literary device, like a repetition within that first chapter. As we get further through the book, anytime she gets into a period of extreme stress, to which she does at the end and a few times through the middle, I will throw in an inhale, exhale, and bring it back to that first chapter. So this is a really, really easy way for people to know exactly what her mental state is, because in that first chapter, I'm very obvious on how her mental state is. That's exactly what the whole premise of that first chapter is, plus the inciting incident. And as she progresses through the book, there's a lot of different things that happen at various stress levels that she needs to deal with. When she's at her most stressed, she brings in that inhale, exhale thing again. Those two words get repeated throughout the book, and it can really, really show you her mental state very, very quickly without me having to go on and on and on about it. So those are some really great examples of how you can use motif in your work. But what are some things that you should be careful of or cautious of if you are using motif? Well, number one is that you want to make sure that it makes sense. Obviously, a motif is being used to have symbolic resonance within your work. If you're just throwing it in there because, hey, I really like the number 13, it's not going to have that same symbolic presence. You can definitely do that. You can put whatever it is you want. It's your book. But if it's not going to have the symbolic resonance that a motif does, then it's not really going to make any sense and it's not going to provide any value to a reader. So it's just kind of extra fluff that you definitely don't need there. Plus, it's a wasted opportunity because if you are going to make a point of repeating something several times throughout the book, wouldn't you want it to make sense to the reader, give them extra value, add extra layers to your story? So if you are going to use motif, make sure that it actually makes sense to what you're doing. It doesn't have to be the secret of life, but something that ties into what you're trying to say is definitely a lot more valuable than just something random. The second thing to watch out for is the amount of repetition that you're using. Obviously, depending on what kind of genre you're writing, what kind of story you're writing, and how you are representing your symbols or imagery will depend on how many times you want to repeat it. If it's a spoken word or a line, you probably don't want to repeat it every 3 chapters as it's going to get really, really repetitive. However, like I said in the rom-com example, you might want to use a symbol a lot towards the ending to really hammer that point home and almost be a little quirky and campy because that's your kind of style of writing. So you really need to be careful when you're using motif that you are using repetition to its maximum potential. Don't go too far and really make sure that it is making sense throughout your prose. The next thing that you want to be cautious of, or it's just more of a tip on using motif, is that you don't need to use the exact same image every single time. So for instance, when I talked about the heroes wearing green, that is something that would be the same all the way through, but you don't necessarily need to do that. You can have something that is repeated in different ways. I use the example of having Hamlet in a thriller novel. So you might see a copy of Hamlet. You might hear a phrase from Hamlet. Maybe somebody has a picture on their wall with a quote from the play. One of these times that I've used it was in Mercury Rises. So this book, I have referenced it in my series before, has a scene that is very, very pivotal for 2 characters. And it is a very calm night and they are on a street corner. And so there's this imagery that I have in here. There is a flickering streetlight. And then immediately after that, the person standing in front of her who has black painted fingernails is clenching her fists. So she's seeing black, white, black, white. The lights are going on, off, on, off, on, off. I reference Morse code, SOS, SOS. It's also kind of got that same thrum as like a heartbeat. So in that particular instance, I'm conveying the emotions of these characters because they're not really talking about them, but it definitely gives that tension, it gives the mood, it gives emotion, a lot of those things of why you would want to use motif, and they aren't necessarily using the exact same image, but they're using that same tempo, that on, off, on, off, on, off imagery in various different ways. This is a nice way to change it up while still having the same emotion and the same concept flowing through your work without being super, super repetitive by showing the exact same thing every single time. This also leads us to our next tip about using motif in the sense that it doesn't have to be through the entire piece of work. In this particular instance, I use it in that chapter only, and that motif ties in well with that particular scene and to what is happening. It isn't something that has to be a motif all the way through your story. Obviously, the bigger your motif is, the more room it's going to need to breathe. Thus, it's going to need to go through several different chapters. But in this example, I'm only using it in 1 chapter. Another really good example of this is in The Raven King by Maggie Stiefvater. It's one of my favorite series, and unfortunately, I do not have my copy right now, but there is one particular scene that she has, and that is the 4th book in the Raven Boys cycle, and she has a very important scene between 2 characters. The scene, I think, virtually has no dialogue, and it's only about a page, page and a half, very short, and it's almost all description. So instead of just having a page, page and a half description, she breaks it up with the line, and it was this, and then she goes on to more description, and then the next, and it was this. and it was this. And it's really, really great because it breaks up that description. It makes it easier to read, easier to digest. Plus, the "and it was this" is super, super important in terms of what is happening with those two characters at the time. I don't want to have any spoilers, but obviously it's a very important moment and a defining moment between the relationship between these two characters. "And it was this" is exactly what it is. This is what their relationship is. And that line, that motif that she has through that chapter totally makes sense. But she doesn't use it throughout the series. It's encapsulated in that particular section. You can use writing structures like that to convey motif, and it can be on a smaller scale instead of a huge, huge work of prose. This is also a good way to get into motif, because if you are not great with trying to do that on a larger scale, maybe try something a little bit smaller and see how that works for you. And the last thing about using motif is that you want to make sure that it makes sense. Just because you are including something for motif, let's say a copy of Hamlet sitting somewhere, you are going to want to make sure that it fits in the scene. You don't want to just shoehorn details in to push your motif along. Either you need to change your scene or you need to change how you're representing it within that scene, because if it doesn't make sense, or you're really forcing your characters to kind of go out of their way to find the object or say the line, it's not going to come across as genuine, and it's going to kind of stand out to your audience. Whereas motif is something that you kind of want it to blend into the background, kind of those paint colors on your wall. People see it, it makes sense, but it's not going to be jumping out at them and taking over the entire scene. All right, so those are my tips on motif. I feel like this is probably going to be one of the longest videos in the series, but like I said, this is one of my favorite literary devices to use because there are so many different ways you can use it. There are so many different things you can do with it. And as a reader, I absolutely love finding these kind of Easter eggs and these kind of things that the author set up for us to find. So make sure when you are using it, you're using it to its advantage, and definitely play with it if you get a chance to do so, because it is super, super fun to use, and I absolutely love it. Next time you are watching a movie or a television show, I'm sure you're going to see it somewhere else. See where you can find examples of it in your real life and apply them to the work that you are working on. So thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying this series, make sure you're hitting that like button below this video to let YouTube know this is something worth watching. And if you don't want to miss the next one, make sure you're hitting the subscription bar and the notification bell below this video. And I will see you all later.